Sacred Heart is proud to sponsor Pensacola Histories in recognition of the Daughters of Charity who brought their mission of care to Pensacola over 90 years ago.
Hello and welcome to our continuing series of stories about Pensacola, North America's first place city. And in this story today, we'll be talking about one of the men who made a great difference in the evolution of Pensacola's business back in the 1880s and 90s, and his name was William Dudley Chipley. Colonel Chipley was a Georgian who was born in at the area of Columbus, Georgia, the cotton area of Columbus, Georgia. And after his education at Transylvania University, he entered the Confederate Army, fought in a number of battles, was wounded a couple of times, and ultimately, when he was discharged, he held the rank of colonel. Well, when the war ended, of course, the South was in disarray, and for a number of years, Chipley, I think we'd have to say, moved back and forth in a rather undetermined direction. He went through a period in which he became involved in a rather sordid scandal in his home state. He finally managed to come away from that, and at that point in time was employed by one of the emerging railroads in the state of Georgia. Now we have to remember that by the time we get into the early 1870s, the South was slowly beginning to rebuild the railroad systems which had been so badly abused and in some cases destroyed during and after the war. This was the case in Georgia, and Chipley had got great experience doing this, and then tying in for a brief time with a fairly new railroad that was making considerable progress. And that was the Baltimore and Ohio. And once he was successful with them, he was located by the emerging L&N system. And they sent Mr. Chipley to this area to become the general manager of what first was called the Pensacola and Louisville, when that line was rebuilt in 1870 from downtown Pensacola up to Flomaton Junction. And it changed names a couple of times. That's not part of our story really, but Chipley began working here in 1876. And did a lot to improve that line, which was, of course, becoming a vital link coming from the port of Pensacola up to link with the Mobile and Montgomery Railroad at Flomaton. Well, Chipley, of course, had another view. And at this point in time, when we get toward the end of the 1870s, we had a rather unusual situation emerging in all of Florida. The Florida Internal Improvement Fund had gone into very serious troubles sometimes earlier for reasons we are not part of our story here today. But by the time we get to just about 1880, the Improvement Fund was in a position where they could begin negotiating with railroad builders to provide an incentive, I guess that's the proper word for it, that where the state, along with some federal assistance, would give a railroad builder, a building railroad, I guess is a better term, so many acres of Florida ground for every mile of track that they completed along a route which was deemed to be an essential for the state. There were a number of people conflicting or seeking those grants from the state. Henry Plant, Henry Flagler, the railroad builders in the south and center of the state, and of course Chipley representing the L&N. And of course, by the time we get to 1880, the negotiations had been complete and the work was able to begin. And Chipley's work was to build a railroad from the Pensacola docks to the Chattahoochee River, about 160 miles. At this point in time, that line would connect with another railroad being built out of Jacksonville to the west, so that when both were completed, we would have a route running from Pensacola to Jacksonville. Well, people looked at the Chipleys Plan, and they had serious questions about it because, now, number one, while it wasn't a great length of the distance that they were worried with, this route was across bridges, across swamps and all sorts of rivers and streams, things like the bay here at Pensacola, just huge engineering challenges. And people said, well, they probably will never do it, or if they do, it's going to take forever. Well, Chipley fooled them. He brought in great engineering talent and a lot of very able people. He was working with, of course, a higher up in the L&N system by the name of Fred DeFuniak, and they in turn laid out the route that would take them across the area, and they assigned the actual construction to 6 different companies. And each company had a specific segment of the route to build, do the whole thing from start to finish. And these people had enough financial incentive that they went to work and did a wonderful job, bringing in hundreds and hundreds of people. And surprisingly, that railroad was completed by mid-1882. It was functional, and they were able to run trains from downtown across to the Chattahoochee. There are all sorts of stories about the ceremonies that Chipley had conducted when he did this, because people in Pensacola were just euphoric about this, because today in the 21st century, I'm afraid many people do not appreciate how folks of the 1880s and 90s and beyond looked toward railroads as the vital link to their prosperity and their style of life. And the completion of the new Pensacola Atlantic, it was a modern miracle for Pensacola. Well, Chipley, of course, once they had the railroad built, entered into a second phase, because now the P&A had received 23,000 acres of land for every mile that they completed. And that meant that overall they owned about 3 million acres between here and the Chattahoochee. And that's fine, that was fine back then, but there were no people. Little Milton was about the only village that existed in that between Pensacola and the Chattahoochee. And so Chipley and his lieutenants realized that unless they did some unique things, they had no traffic. And so immediately they began to become what I would call Pensacola's first great promoters. And they were. They produced all sorts of literature that illustrated what could be done with this beautiful land here in Northwest Florida. I think they lied a little bit, because they had pictures of fruits and vegetables which ostensibly were grown on this property here, which would challenge the imagination and the mind. But they sent this literature all over, and they attracted people coming to take a look, perhaps to buy and invest. Another thing that they did, of course, early on was to create a Northwest Florida Chautauqua. They did this right on the banks of the little lake that was the formation point for the village of Defuniak Springs, and the Chautauqua came into being there. And of course, they offered wonderful excursion rates. Now, typical of this was, and this is an example. You and I might be living in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, as this began. We picked up the Milwaukee Journal, and here's an ad for the Chautauqua. Basically, it would say, we will sell you your round-trip rail fare, overnight accommodations in Pullman cars on the site, admission to all of the events, all this for $12 or $13. And of course, people came, and the show that they put on at Chautauqua was wonderful, and of course it did attract people, and step by step, one by one, people began to arrive here. Now, in addition to that, of course, they began to put together other little, what we would call farm-to-market villages. And most of these, incidentally, were named after Chipley's lieutenants. You find Caryville and Chipley and Bonifay, and all of these were railroad officials. And if you take a look at the mileage, it's kind of interesting, because those villages were spaced out roughly 50 to 100 miles apart. And basically, they were necessary because the railroad engines, of course, had to re-water periodically as they made their move back and forth. And so Chipley and Bonifay and the other places were watering centers for the railroad engines, and they became farm-to-market villages as well. And all of this, of course, is part of the work that Chipley did. Well, now, as he continued his work with the railroad, Chipley also became very much interested in local government, because he recognized that as a railroad leader, he had to be able to get certain things done by the county and, of course, by the city itself. And so when we came to 1885, Chipley was one of those who encouraged local businessmen to petition the legislature to change our form of government. Up from that point, from the beginning of Pensacola in the United States, the era beginning in 1821, we had a alderman, a city council of aldermen with a mayor. And that's the way things had operated up to 1885. Chipley and some others said, this is too slow, too deliberate, we're not getting things done. And they petitioned to changed the system to a commission system with a much smaller number of people, and where the commissioners themselves would have a great deal more individual power. And this passed on, and Chipley, of course, almost at once became a commissioner. He was elected a commissioner, and he was put in charge of public safety. And it was Chipley that literally remade all of our police and fire protection for the community, and instituted a lot of other activities and progressive things that were needed. The city, of course, in this time now put through its first sewer system as a complement to the private water system. And things of that kind were being pushed by Chipley. Well, as Chipley worked, of course, he was identified with the railroad. And at this point in time, a new newspaper arrived here, was put in place here, called The Commercial. It was operated, owned and operated by a man named Dennis Wolfe. And Mr. Wolfe looked upon Chipley as some sort of an ogre. He said he was a manipulator. He's using his power as a railroad man to do things that should not be. And so the editorials in the Commercial were very, very unpleasant to Mr. Chipley. So by the time we reached the end of the 1880s, Mr. Chipley formed an alliance with one of his associates, Richard Carey, and another newspaper man named O'Connor, and they created still a new newspaper which became known as the Pensacola News. And of course it was the editorial opposite of what was being done in the Commercial. The News backed and supported and editorially praised the things that Chipley was doing, while Dennis Wolfe and the News and the Commercial did not. Well, we moved into the early part of the 1890s, and Chipley's work in the community had been, I think the proper word would be respected, because the railroad was doing many wonderful things. Chipley was a visionary. He could see that in his own mind that Pensacola port was going to become a major factor in the economy of the country. He believed, as others did at that time, that our country was going to engineer a canal across, an interocean canal across Nicaragua. And so Mr. Chipley went to New York, got the L&N Railroad officials to set aside considerable sums of money to build a better port down right on the docks here, and also to build such things as a coal tipple for coal exports, and also a grain elevator to help sustain and improve our exports in agriculture. All of these things were the product of William Chipley's genius. Well, he wanted to go further. He could see that the next step for helping the community, and also for helping his company, the railroad, was to become a United States Senator. Now, in these days, of course, the United States Senators were chosen not popularly, but by the state legislatures. And so Mr. Chipley became a candidate for the Senate in 1896. He was opposed by a local man with a very prominent name. He was Stephen Russell Mallory, Jr., the son of the man who had been our Confederate Secretary of the Navy. They were both seeking to unseat the Senator Call, who had become a rather unpopular man at that time. So it was just a hotly contested affair, and it took a great many ballots before, with a considerable amount of shifting back and forth, and what some people said was a little political hanky-panky. Nonetheless, Mr. Mallory was elected senator. And Mr. Chipley, the story goes, as he returned home that night from Tallahassee on his private car, the train was met at the depot by local citizens, who literally escorted him to a carriage that had no horses on it, and local citizens pulled that carriage through the streets to Chipley's home, saying, "Look, we recognize what you have done, and we just wanted to tell you we support you all the way." Well, less than 6 months later, Chipley was in Washington on business for the railroad, and as he came out of the Department of Commerce building, he clutched his chest, he stumbled, fell, and was dead of a heart attack. And so Chipley was lost to us. Well, if you go downtown today into Plaza Ferdinand, you will see about a 30-foot tall obelisk, which on its base has a small tablet and a small bust of William Dudley Chipley, who is the only civilian to which the Pensacola community has made such a contribution. He is our only citizen remembered that way.